Breaking news today: Ukraine is a vital part of NATO, and NATO is vital to Ukraine. An article published in Foreign Affairs last week argued for cutting Ukraine off from NATO. Cato Institute researchers Justin Logan and Joshua Shiflison made 5 assertions in defense of their position. However, as is commonplace in this type of writing, their article is heavy on opinion and light on evidence. It is important to debunk Logan and Shiflison's 5 claims one by one because articles like these are so useful to Kremlin propagandists in their campaigns of disinformation. This assertion demonstrates shocking levels of disconnection from reality and historical ignorance. Vladimir Putin has been at war with NATO, both directly and indirectly, for over 15 years. Putin invaded democratic Georgia when it sought NATO membership of its own volition. Putin invaded Ukraine in response to pro-European protests on Maidan, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, in 2014. Near the border with another NATO member, Turkey, hospitals in Syria were bombed by Putin's Wagner Group proxies. They funded international coups to undermine democracies all over the world. Russian state agents have kidnapped multiple Americans and murdered British citizens, attempted a coup in a country that had already signed a NATO accession protocol, and abducted an Estonian border guard. Yevgeny Prigozhin rose through the ranks of the Kremlin's mafia by assisting Putin in interfering with American elections, and Russian influence operations left their fingerprints on the pro-Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom. And when Putin, incorrectly this time, judged NATO nations to be weak, he invaded Ukraine once more. Putin's bloody-minded obsession with weakening NATO has manifested itself in every move he's made and every life his forces have taken. I'm sorry, but I can't help you if you're still fooled by Putin. These 2 assertions are intertwined, making them easier to disprove collectively. It should be made clear that Ukraine is not making a formal membership request at this time. It wants to join NATO in the future, after Ukrainian forces have freed their country and people, on the basis of the blood it has spilled and the benefits it offers. It's the same predicament NATO's in now. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Norway, and Finland are all countries that Russia shares borders with. The addition of Ukraine to NATO poses no new security risks. What's more, the authors at the Cato Institute base their arguments on a fallacious theory called escalation, which states that appeasing Russia would be preferable to deterring it. Debunking this theory is important because it could seriously hamper the Ukrainian war effort and put the lives of many Ukrainians in danger. The effects of unwarranted concern about escalation have already manifested. Western leaders have been on the fence about fully supporting Ukraine since Putin's re-invasion in February 2022. When Ukraine requested defensive weapons, NATO leaders voiced public concerns that Putin would respond by increasing the conflict's intensity. Therefore, they held back on the long-range missiles. Then they stopped releasing tanks. Then they stopped releasing jets. In the meantime, many Ukrainian civilians were killed. Ukrainian soldiers who were waiting for armor were killed. People in Ukraine died while waiting for air support. Russian occupation of Ukraine is not hypothetical. While politicians and think tanks feared what Putin might do, Ukrainians were killed as a result of his actual actions. That Putin is so vengeful or irrational that he would start a nuclear war rather than withdraw from Ukrainian territory is central to the escalation theory. Putin and his mob bosses have threatened the West with nuclear destruction in an effort to plant this theory in their minds. Vladimir Putin is attempting a watered-down version of Richard Nixon's madman theory. To believe this would be to accept the paradox that a dictator insane enough to launch a nuclear attack on Ukraine over territory he doesn't need can also be sane enough to broker a lasting peace. The escalation theory, however, has been disproven by Putin's own actions. On multiple occasions, Putin has crossed borders by force, without provocation, in order to bolster his domestic support and expand his control. And Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed coup has proven that escalation to nuclear war is not inevitable. The Wagner uprising proved to the world that the emperor was wearing nothing but a throne. Putin hesitated at the crucial juncture. After being publicly shamed, he quickly conceded in order to keep his iron grip on power and the flow of cash unimpeded. For the time being at least, Prigozhin is free, and it appears that Putin can be pragmatic in the face of defeat. And Prigozhin proved once and for all that Putin has no more loyalists. Throughout the uprising, Russian troops were unwilling to risk their lives for Putin. Why then would they carry out the Kremlin's suicidal order to start nuclear war? Putin is not suicidal, despite his intelligence. Since Xi Jinping has personally ordered Putin not to use nuclear weapons, even so-called tactical nuclear weapons are off-limits to Putin. In sum, Prigozhin has debunked the absurd idea that appeasing Putin is necessary to prevent global catastrophe, and Russian nuclear threats are meaningless. The writers of the article have got this all wrong. Ukrainians are not looking for protection from NATO. Rather, they want to be recognized by the organization whose stability they have risked their lives to protect. Today, Ukraine boasts Europe's strongest armed forces. In an open letter, Germany's army chief bemoans his bare force. The size of the British armed forces has dropped to levels not seen since the Napoleonic Wars. Instead of asking Europe's strongest military to take the helm, NATO should beg them to join. However, the authors have consistently underestimated Ukraine. Before Putin's second invasion, Justin Logan spent the month advocating for Ukrainian capitulation, concession, and surrender. His words of doom for Ukraine were chilling. If the Russians came into Ukraine, they would simply destroy the Ukrainian army, and Ukraine prevailing in a conflict is just not in the cards. About a year ago, the Kremlin claimed that Russia had the world's second-best army. Russian conscripts and Wagner ex-convicts are vying for the position of Ukraine's second-strongest army today. When it comes to Ukraine, these self-proclaimed realists have been completely wrong. They claimed we should give up on Ukraine and that NATO is useless at this point. The Russian war effort has benefited from the apologism of their fellow realists in the Kremlin. In the early days of the war, the United States offered Zelensky a white flag in lieu of weapons due to the realist theory. These aren't fresh issues, either. Winter is Coming was written in 2015 as a response to the lies coming out of the Kremlin at the time. On Putin, I have a perfect track record. Is that so? The realists also have a track record, and it's not a good one. They would be wise to keep quiet until Ukraine has taken back every inch of territory from the occupier, rather than trying to force their views on the world. How ridiculous. The authors express concern that Russia might fight harder after witnessing Russian troops terrorize Ukrainian civilians on a daily basis, raping young girls and boys, torturing citizens for sport, and deporting millions to Siberia. Do they really want us to think about leaving even more Ukrainians vulnerable to torture and genocide? Putin started this war because he thought he could subjugate Ukraine before it joined NATO. Defeating the Russian army on the battlefield and being accepted into NATO are the only ways to prevent further imperial dreams from the Kremlin. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established in 1949 to deter a Russian land invasion of free Europe. Ukrainian soldiers are winning the war that NATO was established to fight with every square meter of territory they retake. Heroes in Ukraine risk their lives every day to protect the stability of NATO. Ukraine has presented NATO with the greatest offer in military history. It can eliminate its greatest rival at no cost in terms of NATO lives. Ukraine only wants the expired military gear that NATO members have stored away but are planning to discard anyway as payment for their victory in the war. Ukrainian hopes to join NATO were met with open arms 15 years ago. The people of Ukraine have suffered and sacrificed enough. When the Ukrainians eventually win this war, they should be welcomed into NATO. Salute to Ukraine. Honor to the brave.